and it's a pleasure for me to be over here and welcome you back in the afternoon session. I hope you had a lovely morning session.
Yes.
Yeah, I can see the cheerful faces. Everybody was happy. And my role has been in the past year, as I was appointed by the governor, to reach out to the communities to see how we can bring in more people into the United Nations Association. And to let you know, when you go out in the community, you have to let them know that there is an association like this. Because majority of the people don't know about it. So once we go into the community, we let them know, then they have to feel that yes, United Nations is doing something. And not only they're taking money from us, from the US, but they're giving back also. So we have to change that perception. That's very, very important. They are not good in mics, so. But, so please go out today and when you see your friends in the communities, parties, reach out and let them know about United Nations Association and what a wonderful job they're doing. And ask them to become member of this. And that's important. So on behalf of United Nations Association USA Denver chapter, I would like to thank partners at the Corbell School of International Studies, the Organization for Future International Administration Professionals. Corporate sponsors are, you must have got good bagels this morning, Brugger's, Noodles and Company, and Kaladi Coffee. Community outreach sponsors, League of Women Voters Denver, Denver Center for International Studies. But for me, the best part is to introduce my mentor, my lifetime coach, Professor VID00001. And Professor Nanda has taught at the University of Denver since 1965. In addition to his numerous scholarly achievements, Professor Nanda has voluntarily contributed his expertise and energy to many non-profit endeavors to make the world a better place and a peaceful place. The United Nations Association has been honored to count him as one of us for many years. He was formerly the United States delegate to the World Federation of the United Nations Association in Geneva and vice chair of its executive council. He has also served on the board of directors of the United Nations Association USA, both locally and nationally. So at this time, I would like to welcome Colorado's Mr. United Nations, Professor VID00001.
Actually, Mr. United Nations is coming. I'm simply a proxy. I am deeply honored to have among us and to present him to you and to welcome him. Person that I consider to be an ideal public servant, a person who has all his life helped, served humanity and especially people here. You recall that many of you probably know about him. At Harvard, his undergraduate and graduate, Stanford for his PhD, started at the White House as a fellow, and from there served as assistant secretary in education, Department of Education, came back and for 12 years representing us in the House, then a term representing us in the Senate. After that, you recall that President Clinton asked him to serve as Undersecretary for Global Affairs. And from there on, you probably know that called by the United Nations Foundation, and especially the person who put in $1 billion, and he took that job. And in the last all these years again, he has been working on issues that have been central to our own concerns. He is the one who put Kyoto Protocol on the front part on the agenda of the United Nations, and he is the one who was responsible at that time for climate change policy in the United States to take shape. And now women's rights, world peace that has been central to him and a great deal of interest to him and to all of us, peace and security, children's health, environment, all those issues have been again central to him. And in all these years, an organization that today I would consider it indispensable, and about which in this country there hasn't been a great deal of interest at times, and although there is people who are have a great deal of interest in it, they are not very vocal. And then he is the one who has been spreading that awareness, and I personally have got to be beholden to him. As the Undersecretary, he asked, and through President Clinton, he had me on the UN Human Rights Conference that was going to be in Vienna, a delegate representing the US. And then he knew that at that time I was not a US citizen. I got the wonderful, wonderful diplomatic passport that I had to send back. Tim was angry at me. He said, God damn. No, he didn't say that. He didn't say that. The message was clear. He said, you are not a citizen? I said, no, sir. But I want you to know that he is a person I have admired all these years. When I started writing on climate change, on the environment, all the experts that he had brought in from Jim Hansen, and he has held hearings. I cited them all in footnotes. Those footnotes are not very good for your eyes, but still read them. And they talk about nobody else but Tim Worth. Here he is, ladies and gentlemen, my wonderful friend and a person that we have all admired.
Well, Ben, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here and see so many old friends. My sister Carla's back there, and the guy that was the chairman of the Democratic Party when I was putting my foot in the water, Mark Hogan, is over here. We had an office at the end of this long flight of stairs. You had to go up. It was sort of like going up to meet with God. And I got up there and I thought, what am I going to say? And I said, the problem with this, I got to raise all this money. And he said, that's not a problem. If you're not sure enough of yourself and why you're running and what you're doing, that you can't go and ask people for all of this money and raise it and look them in the eye and have them give you a check, you have no business running for office. It's one of the great lessons that I had. And Mark, I know you've read all the footnotes of those studies, but thank you very much. I haven't seen Mark in a long time, and I just have a special debt to him. Susan Kirk is here, who also was deeply engaged in a lot of the Worth activities, and many, many other old friends. So thank you very much for coming, all of you. It's a beautiful Saturday afternoon, and I guess if I had my way, I would not be sitting in a room on a beautiful Saturday afternoon in Colorado, but you're really great to be here. I thought what I might do, what might be fun, is to talk a little bit about our view of the UN at the UN Foundation. So sort of what works, what doesn't work, why we do what we do, and then sort of stop at that and spend maybe a little more than half the time we have together thinking about your questions, and so please it up, so keep that in mind. The UN Foundation began with Ted Turner's great sense of the UN. He had believed that it was the UN that kept us out of shooting war during the Cold War period of time, and was deeply indebted to that. And he decided at the height of his fortune, he at that point had $3 billion, and he was on his way to making a good deal more, but he had $3 billion, and he decided that he would give $1 billion to UN causes. At that time, the reason he did it was that the UN was the U.S. was $1 billion in debt to the UN. We weren't paying our dues, and we were about to lose our seat in the General Assembly, our vote in the General Assembly under the UN rules. And Ted always laughed and said he thought if he paid off that $1 billion, he might then be able to sue the United States Congress for $1 billion. And he said maybe I'd make a little money on the side. But anyways, it turned out an individual couldn't pay off the debt and couldn't pay off the sovereign responsibilities of a country, and so Ted set up the foundation and asked me if I would leave the State Department and come and join it and start this foundation. Classic Turner way. We were at the White House for a session before he'd asked me. We were at the White House for a major climate event which I'd organized, and Ted was there at the time, married to Jane Fonda, and very involved in, they were very involved in the climate world. And we were agreed to go out and meet for dinner at 7 o'clock. Ted is the promptest person in the world. And so they left and got to this hotel dining room at 7 o'clock. And the President Clinton wanted to keep this thing going, and we kept going, and we kept going, and we kept going, and it was about 8:30 by the time, and I couldn't leave. And I was responsible for the event. So I busted out of there finally and got over, and my wife Rena was at dinner with Ted and Jane. I walked in the dining room, the door was here, and Ted and Jane were sitting way back over there. And of course everybody in the dining room know that they were there, that's where they were all watching, So I walked in over here, and Ted saw me coming in, and he was about ready to go to bed. So he'd been there for an hour and a half, that was enough, I'm going to bed. And he yelled across the room, "Hey, Worth! You want to run this foundation?" All of you, oh! And there's a conversation going back and forth. So that was the invitation. The Turner Foundation. So I looked very carefully at what Ted had said about his gift, and the gift was not $1 billion to the UN, which wouldn't have been interesting to be just a pipeline to have money go to the UN, but he had said, I'd like to focus the $1 billion on UN causes. And that got really interesting because, of course, everything is a UN cause. And if we had just about everything in the world the UN touches, and if we had the ability to begin to forge, how to use the $1 billion, that got really interesting. So with a couple of other people, we began the foundation and put together a very distinguished, very small board, which we currently have. It's just a remarkable group of people. We have a 14-person board now that includes Kofi Annan and Dr. Gru Brundtland and Mohammed Yunus and people you all know. If most organizations would die to have one of those people, and we have this remarkable group of very, very experienced individuals. Anyway, the board very quickly set the policy as to what we ought to be doing with this. We had our first meeting across the street from the UN. And unlike a lot of organizations that spend an enormous amount of time, analyzing and analyzing and analyzing and getting to a point of analysis paralysis, it took this group exactly an hour to say, well, what we ought to do is to focus on the most difficult issues, the ones that are the hardest for the UN to undertake politically, and we ought to stay upstream as much as possible, so that we're not getting into doing things that government ought to do after things fail, but we have to be upstream. And we sent a note back to Kofi and said, Kofi Annan was then the Secretary General, and said we want to work on women's reproductive health and population issues. We want to work on climate change issues, and we want to work on children's health issues, and set up a whole unit to help the politics of the UN, and that would be the initial mission. And I sent that back over to Kofi, and it was a fax in that day and age, and got back an answer immediately, and in 2 hours we were in business. It was a great Turner way of doing business, but let's just go, let's just figure it out. Everybody sort of knew, let's take on the hardest issues and go ahead and do them, and we've pursued that ever since. We began as quite a traditional foundation, making a lot of grants out to places and individuals and in countries, and that turned out to be very unsatisfying because we were just a tiny little bit of money given what the world's problems are. And there's a certain arrogance to grant making in the foundation world as well. And sort of if you're so smart that you're going to be able to create a project that is going to be so excellent that nobody else has thought about it, everybody in the world is going to emulate that, and that permeates a lot of the thinking of much of historic philanthropy. And I found that, and I think our board found that pretty frustrating. And so I went to Kofi and I said, we've got to change this. And he said, I agree. He said, I think what you want to do is to shift your strategy and see if you can focus on what I would call, said Kofi, I would call problems without passports. Pick out, a few very big issues where you can bring your convening capability, you can use your money as seed money, you can bring in the private sector, which the UN has to learn how to do, and you can probably find a lot of partners around the world from countries to take on some of these big problems. And that was great as far as I was concerned, because that would be sort of a much more imaginative and interesting way to think about philanthropy, and we have followed that model ever since. I don't know anybody else who does things that way, but I would certainly urge a lot of our philanthropic brethren who are much, much bigger than we are to do so. We are now a foundation of about 220 people, and a big intern program of 20 or 25 wonderful kids every year, and a budget of about $200 million a year, of which $30 million comes from TED, and 170 comes from all of these other sources. And we run about 10 campaigns, we call them. 10 very, very specific, targeted, focused issues. The first one that we got involved with was helping Rotary International complete the effort on polio. Rotary had started this in the 1980s. It was much more difficult than they thought it was going to be. They were sort of running out of gas. Kofi asked us if we'd please put our shoulder behind that. We set up an office, and we have, over the last 12 years, or 10 years, raised about $3 billion for the elimination of polio. And this last year, the biggest problem area outside of Nigeria was India. When we began, thousands of cases of polio, and we were just in India, and they had not had a polio case in a year. I mean, it a huge achievement. That's the UN, and that's the UN's reach and its ability to really engage public health authorities. Very interesting, because the Indian government began by saying, we don't want any help from the outside, we can do all of this ourselves, don't worry about it. And it was the UN and the World Health Organization that was really able to work with the government of India and develop a very cooperative program. And we brought some of the major Indian business leadership in and got them to be working with the Prime Minister and agree to do it. And so we now have left in polio just polio along the Afghan-Pakistan borders, one of the nastiest places in the world, and then a virulent kind of strains of polio still popping up in Nigeria. And that's a whole other story. It was very, very interesting, but we're trying to lick that one. So that was the first one that we did. That led to setting up a major program on measles, which we started with the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, and the American Red Cross, UNICEF, and the World Health Organization. We've practically eliminated all measles in Africa. Just opened the measles program in India. And interesting, we announced yesterday a major new initiative back in the United States called Shot at Life, which is to encourage support for vaccines and begin to answer a lot of the very, very bad publicity that's been out there about how vaccines provide all kinds of problems for kids that has been incredibly inaccurate and very, very destructive. And interestingly, these are issues that are running now in a pretty dangerous way for other kids. You know, we're the #1 area in Colorado where there is a lack of vaccines. Boulder. A lot of people know it. Why is that? People looking at the internet, they read all of this bad medicine, bad stuff that's still out there. Oh no, we shouldn't vaccinate like it's very dangerous, you know, for other places anyway. So that the measles program is another, you know, really terrific healthcare issue that we're doing. We started a fellow named Rick Riley. I don't know how many of you remember reading Sports Illustrated. In the back of Sports Illustrated was an essay every week by a guy named Rick Riley, a hilarious sort of spoof on all the macho nature of sports and so on. Rick being a very creative guy. And he went to Africa with his daughter, who was on some kind of an exchange program. And while she was doing that, he was writing his column. And he began to think, why is she doing health stuff and all I do is sports? So he said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to write a column, and I'm going to call it Nothing But Nets. I deal with nets. So I think we ought to have a program for malaria bed nets. Call it Nothing But Nets. And he then searched the internet and found us, UN Foundation. And he called us up on Tuesday, and they were going to press on Thursday night. And he said there's going to be a piece, and he called up and talked to somebody in our office who fortunately picked up and understood that this was what it would be all about. Called up and said, this is Rick Riley, we know Rick Riley. And we're going to have a piece on the back of this most read piece in Sports Illustrated on called Nothing But Nets. And I want you to be the recipient of this. Can you set up a program to do this? So we checked it all out. There was this mad scramble on a Tuesday night. And by Wednesday night, we had a website set up and so on, and bingo, you know, there was $1 million in the coffer by Monday afternoon from Nothing But Nets, and this hilarious column that Rick Riley had written. You know, a lot of people reading this. So I said, I'll call up Rick Riley and thank him. So I called up Rick Riley, and I found him, and he had area code 303. I don't know what that's all about. So I called him up and I said, Mr. Riley, my name's Tim Worth, and he didn't finish. He said, I know who you are. And he said, I worked on your first 2 campaigns. He'd gone to Boulder, and he didn't know that I was the head of the UN Foundation. I didn't know who Rick Riley was. It was terrific. Anyway, he's been the master of ceremonies for our big dinner in New York every year. You can imagine the stuffy UN and all the diplomats and all that kind of stuff. Rick Riley kind of telling stories about Tiger Woods and so on at the UN dinner. It is, anyway, it's a little bit of a different world, but it makes it a lot of fun. So the health stuff has been really very, very interesting. On the climate side, we've been deeply involved with helping the Secretary General focus on, you know, what the UN's rules ought to be and how they ought to think about them, and that's been a major commitment. We've done a lot with energy. Coming up is Rio Plus 20. The 20th anniversary of the Rio meeting is going to be in June in Rio, and we have formulated and driven for the Secretary General a major program called Sustainable Energy for All. There are about more than 1.5 billion people in the world who have no access to modern energy services. And the goal is to try to define how the UN can help and set the goal of 100% access to sustainable energy by the year 2030, a doubling of energy efficiency by the year 2030 globally, and a doubling of the penetration of renewable energy by 2030. So that would be one of the major outcomes of this meeting in Rio. Interesting commentary on this terrific Secretary General. Maybe many of you saw him when he was here in Denver. He's been a wonderful surprise for everybody. when he came in after Kofi, who has a real presence about him, and he's really you know when Kofi walks into the room, you sort of feel, he's like Muhammad Yunus. He's sort of a saint-like sense of him. He has an aura about him. And Ban Ki-moon, as many of you saw him, is very, very different. He is a global affairs diplomat coming through the hierarchical diplomatic service of South Korea. And that's about as un-saint-like a place as you can be. I mean, our State Department's bad, I can't imagine. The Asian is very, very vertical and very structured. And he was everybody's candidate to be the Secretary General, arrived at the UN. And before he came, he called me up and wanted to sit down. And what did he want to talk about? He wanted to talk about climate change. We had breakfast in New York. Couldn't have been more surprised. I was all ready to talk about, I don't know what, and what he wanted to talk about was climate change. I said, wow, this is interesting. It's the last thing in the world I thought he'd want to talk about. And he has, over the last 5 years, been just terrific, sort of leading the world and continuing to be a major advocate for two issues. One is climate change, and the second is the empowerment of women. I mean, what a modern, interesting agenda for somebody, coming in a situation like that, and just what was for me anyway, just the opposite of what we expected. So we've been doing a lot of work with him on climate, and obviously a lot of work with him on the issues of population. We organized a major, and I'll stop with all of this, a major cross-cutting initiative at the UN on adolescent girls. We've started a couple of very interesting campaigns related to girls and related to the unmet need in family planning. There are 215 million women and couples in the world that want family planning services and can't get them. And the major institution for delivering family planning is UNFPA, the United Nations Family Planning Organization, and headed by a wonderful West African named Babatunde. And one of this is a whole group of really talented West African leaders of major UN agencies, and the Secretary General is helping to drive this. There'll be a big meeting in London in July, and the British and the British government and the Gates Foundation have undertaken what they're calling the golden moment. And can we use this as a time, if we don't get after this unmet need now, at a time when there is the largest bulge in world history of kids entering their childbearing years? If we're not able to provide family planning services now, we go from 8.5 to 10 billion, maybe as much as 12 billion. There's a real opportunity to stabilize the world's population at a lower level and empower women, and the impact on economic development, of course, is very significant at the same time. So that's been a real ride for us, all of these different campaigns and putting our effort on. We have some wonderful 35 to 45-year-old sort of managers in each of the campaigns. And one of the things that I have found most interesting is watching our intern program over the years. We have full-time interns during the academic year, about 22 of them, and they all have very, very real jobs, and we pay them for doing this. And this year, we have 19 women and 3 men. Last year, we had 20 women and 3 men. So I've laid out a program that we've got to have an affirmative action program. And there's something going on. It's very interesting. There's something going on in terms of the preparation of the women, the experience. They come from all over, and they're selected by each of the campaigns selects their interns. It's not a central operation.
When are you moving to our 23 women?
It's really intriguing. We have a number of returned Peace Corps volunteers, and during the year we have really kids that are 23 to 27, and it's overwhelming numbers of women. I just mentioned that as a commentary and what that means for where we are. Final point I would make is that we have a new partnership with the United Nations Association UNA, over its 50-year history, you know, has changed, and we have this, we've really sort of, say, taken it over is not the nice way to put it. I think, say, we have a partnership in that. I think UNA was having a lot of financial troubles, and so we thought that it was very important to see if we could get the UNA chapters around the country focused a little bit more on a few specific missions. And there were a lot of people doing their own item out there. Could we direct or help to direct on some specific questions? A lot of our campaigns are attempts to reach out to the public and get the public much more engaged in international activities. And we do that with nothing but nets. We've had campaigns all across the country, obviously. Polio is a part of that. All of the girls' piece is a part of that. The energy, we think, is growing into that. And we want UNA to be part of that as much as possible. And one of our first targets has been thinking about the battle on Agenda 21. Maybe many of you heard about that. When Rio came 20 years ago, there were three major outcomes of Rio. The first Rio conference, which was the largest gathering of heads of state ever in the world history up until that time. There were three major outcomes. One was the climate treaty. The second one was the biodiversity treaty. And the third was what's called Agenda 21, which was, as we look at the 21st century, how do we think together about, you know, how we sustain life on Earth, how do we sustain the oceans and the atmosphere and forests, and how do we think about transportation and so on. And it was generally a set of agreements that everybody in the world agreed to, and it's the UN at its best in many ways, sort of the idea of these are the norms, this is what it ought to be in the world. And the US was one of the first countries to ratify that. George H.W. Bush did. And interesting, that's gotten picked up, agenda's gotten picked up by the black helicopter crowd, I call it. You know, sort of nuts is not the right word, but there's a cadre of, you know, virulently anti-UN people in the country, and they've decided that Agenda 21 is an attempt by the United Nations and other mysterious international bodies, I think is the language that gets used, to take over the American way and tell you what to do, how to think, and how to live. And the guy that was running for governor the last time around here, you know, where he ran against bicycles, do you remember that?
Yes.
Well, that came out of Agenda 21, because one of the things in Agenda 21 was that you know, there's going to be more urbanization, and people are going to have to think about alternative transportation modes in urban areas, and one of those are bicycles. Like, duh, you know, I mean, that's going to happen. But that, of course, was part of the UN conspiracy. So I was down at the Denver Post yesterday. I don't know if any of you have been in the Denver Post building. And there's a great big rack of those bicycles for sale for rent in front of the Denver Post. So when I was upstairs talking to the Denver Post editorial board, I said, "There are a bunch of commies up here. You know, all this." Anyway, it's a bit absurd, but this has been raised by, you know, the politics of the silly season right now, and the UNA chapters in Oklahoma were able to get it beaten back. I think that's happened in 4 or 5 different states that have gone to state legislatures and said this is just ridiculous. In Tennessee, we didn't get there early enough, so there was a resolution passed condemning the Agenda 21 and the UN in the Tennessee state legislature, and so we're watching that pretty carefully, because you never know how these things get carried away and where they go. So we're working with the National Association of Counties and the county commissioners, the Association of State Legislators, and so on, to make sure that they have information about all of this, so when questions come up, you know, they can answer them, and these things don't get carried away. But that's an example, I think, of, you know, how, among other things, UNA's, this new relationship can really be useful. So we thank all of you for being part of this. It's really important to be thinking about the UN, and if we can make sure that all of the chapters around the country have some common agendas together, that will be very, very helpful. Anyway, it's a fascinating time, and the UN is a remarkable institution, as you know, feeding just I think more than 150 million people a day, taking care of 30 million refugees every day. I mean, just this stretch of, it was a peacekeeping operation, 120,000 soldiers going into some of the most difficult places in the world. And you think about the UN as sort of the firemen, all over the world when nobody else wants to go there. I mean, who wants to have their soldiers moving into conflict on a border in Mali? I mean, nobody. Who's going to want to be working on the refugee issues of what's going on in South Sudan? And nobody. And the UN is there, and that is the institutionally the place that we all depend upon to try to get a modicum of peace and security, and for really hundreds of millions of people all over the world. So it's a very moving task. It's a very important task, and sometimes the politics is in the black helicopters get kind of fun too. You have to keep your sense of humor about it while all these things are going on. So let me stop at that, and thank you all very much for coming and for being part of UNA's effort. Let me stop and let's get to any questions you want to ask. Introduce yourself, will you, please?
Yeah, David French with the Orbis Institute. We're involved with international leadership for youth. So two-phase questions. One is, what body in the United Nations creates the UN Millennium Goals, and do you think they change in the next few years? Because it was a little optimistic to have that thing happen by 2015.
Yeah. It's a really great question. It's very important to the UN. In 2000, at the turn of the millennium, under Kofi Annan's direction, the UN developed what was called the Millennium Development Goals. And it was a set of goals for a 15-year period of time with percentage reductions, not to solve every problem, but it's have 15-year reductions in child mortality, maternal mortality, increases in the education of girls, decreases in the incidence of AIDS. There were 7 of them. And of course, everybody wanted all the things in there, and the UN, amazingly enough, was able to keep this targeted to 7 major goals. They have all done amazingly well. There's really good momentum now in every one of these except maternal mortality. That's the one where there has not had a lot of progress being made, and that we had the last year's General Assembly, we organized a major initiative on behalf of the Secretary General focused right on maternal mortality, and got commitments from lots and lots of donor governments to increase the focus, particularly on issues of childbirthing and safety and the development of the support mechanisms necessary. So we think that MDG, as it's called, we think that MDG measure will get better. We're about to get to 2015. So what happens after 2015? They're not all of these aren't going to be met. They weren't. I think that almost all of them were a reduction of 50% or 60% in these 7 areas. The Secretary General has used the words Sustainable Development Goal as a replacement for the Millennium Development Goals. He is very taken with the idea of sustainability. He says we really have to get that much more into the world's vocabulary in every way that we possibly can. So he has spoken about developing the Sustainable Development Goals. He will appoint a commission in July to work on this, and it's been leaked that Prime Minister Cameron will be one of the chairs of that commission. There has been Dr. Brundtland was the chairman of one commission leading up to that this last year, and Rio Plus 20, which I mentioned, where the energy piece will come out, is another contribution. How will these differ from the MDGs? Well, we hope not a lot, with a couple of exceptions. You can't do development without energy. It just is not possible. But over the years, the UN has been really kept out of the energy patch by the US and the Saudis, saying we don't want the United States involved at all in energy activity, the United Nations involved in energy activities. And this Secretary General has really broken that with the development of some significant new commitments on energy, and his first wedge on that is his Sustainable Development Initiative. So that's breaking down a bit, and I think you have to think about the next wave with all of the world's energy needs and the need for sustainable energy and the related climate issue. You have to have an MDG that has some focus on energy and slash climate. And the other one that's probably going to have to change is to have an MDG that really focuses on women and reproductive health. The issue of reproductive health and the empowerment of women and the history of that in the UN system has been so strong, and this man's commitment has been so strong, that I think that will be the other one. And there's a lot of work going on by women's groups all over the world. Currently, there is a lot of reaction to that, particularly from the Catholic Church, trying to eliminate any references at all to empowerment of women, reproductive health. And there's a third phrase that they're working in all of the international gatherings to eliminate. So the politics of that, which we see here in the Capitol, you know, right here you see in the Congress, you see in the campaign, and you see in Rio. So that's going to be a battle as to how that one will be obtained. So that's more than you want to
Just one quick footnote, in reference to foundation, and all the interns you see, as you mentioned, how can the foundation and we help get more young people, high school, college, post-college, engaged in not only broader international development, but specifically foundation and UN?
It's a great, I mean, we're up to our ears.
We don't place ourselves, we haven't done it.
You know, I don't want any interns where they don't have real jobs. You know, there's some intern programs where kids just come and put in their time, and we're pretty fierce about making sure that they have a real job and a real experience, you know, when they're with us. That's minor. The broader question is, how does the UN renew itself with a whole new cadre of young people? About 60%, like the U.S. government, about the U.S. government civil service, about 60% of the UN staff is going to retire in the next like 7 years or 9 years, something like that. So there's going to be a huge turnover at the UN, just as there is beginning a huge turnover in the U.S. civil service. And it's, I don't know what's happening in other countries around the world, so it must be somewhat the same. So there's a big push on, you know, to try to get the UN to do a lot more merit hiring. And there's always a temptation at the UN to do national hiring. You know, I'm X country, which is Y percentage of the world's population, and therefore I get Z percentage of the people who are hired. You know, and it's been, you know, that sort of thing's been going on, and we have been involved in some of the reform efforts to try to take this hiring away from that kind of quota system almost, and move it into much more of a professionalized boards and commissions that are doing the hiring, who've got to keep in mind, obviously, that this is a diverse international institution. And that's it's very hard, and it's, you know, the UN is a representative body, and people feel they have a choice, and it's a very sticky question. And there are some countries that are extraordinarily good at working the system. They know how to work the system. And some are very good at working the system and aren't very positive about it. You know, in this hemisphere, the Nicaraguans and the Venezuelans and the Bolivians and the Cubans form a block that on just about every issue, you know, are doing their best to go up the works, you know, whether that's a shot at Uncle Sam or whatever. But they would be a perfect example of this, saying, well, why aren't there 3 Bolivians in the, Humpty Secretariat? So it's a hard issue, but it's going to be a very important one for the future. Stand up, so everybody can hear and introduce yourself.
Right. I'm Tamara Al-Masri, and I'm a Global Affairs graduate student at the University of Denver and Public Relations Board member of the United Nations Association, Denver Metro Chapter. And my question to you was your opinion as far as, do you think that uniting the United Nations Association within the state, let's say within the Colorado state, would it give the message across much better than having each of them have specific mission that they're working towards? Therefore, in Colorado we have different chapters, so if we unite, we send the message stronger. What do you think about that?
There are 4 UNA chapters in Colorado, and what we have attempted to do is to get as much of a common mission across all of the chapters as possible. So, whether there is a separate chapter in Boulder and Colorado Springs and Denver is really a decision that's going to get made here. But what we'd really like to do is to make sure that there is a commonality in terms of mission. Taking, for example, Agenda 21, when we got to really supporting and thinking about the next range of the MDGs and explaining that, that's going to be an extremely important mission, and that's going to be sort of to do some things that are very important to the UN, but also are themselves very interesting. So that's sort of our job to help us set that agenda, and then to make sure that local UNAs are become interested in that and work on a kind of agenda. So that's the hope, anyway, that we can do. Well, I have to stand up so everybody can hear.
Alice Lowe, I'm a global finance, trade, and economic integration MA here in Philadelphia. I was just wondering, what's the most sort of intractable issue that the UN Foundation has sought to make an impact upon, and sort of how it is to affect that?
I suppose the reproductive health issue is the most intractable one. We, as a world, we had great success 20 years ago at Cairo. When the world really changed from a male-based, quota-centered idea of numbers driving population issues to much more of a choice, empowerment, women having the opportunity to make decisions for themselves about the size of their families and the spacing of their children. It was a major change. At that time, 20 years, and I chaired the U.S. delegation, so we were deeply engaged in this, and it was, the politics of it were much more interesting than I thought they would be going in. We were able to unite extraordinary women in leadership positions in the Muslim world. The wife of the Indonesian president, Benazir Bhutto, and who was then the Prime Minister of Pakistan, and Mrs. Mubarak in Egypt, and there were some really fabulous leading women who took that issue on, and then they in turn brought along a lot of the religious leadership, or at least neutralized the religious leadership. On the Catholic side, the Cardinal of the Philippines was really hardcore, and the sister of the president, really set out to neutralize him, and that became a big deal. In the southern part of the Americas, the Catholic Church was very strong and opposed to a lot of this, and the Chileans took that on, and they were the most conservative, and they took that on and sort of neutralized that. So we came out with a document, and I think that the Catholic Church was surprised at how successful the organization of Cairo had been. So that's 20 years ago. Since then, there has been a tremendous reaction back to that, against that. And the church has recruited other religious groups on this same issue. And I think that's fundamentally a political issue. What we're really talking about is the empowerment of women. And in any politics deal, there's a finite amount of political power. And so what happened in Cairo was the transfer of a lot of that political power from traditional male institutions to women and more feminist organizations. And it was palpable. You knew that that had happened. It was a big change. It was a big deal. And now the people who lost are trying to kind of regain the power. And that's what we're seeing. It's very much, there's some ideology to it, obviously there's some religious dogma to it and so on. But I view it more as a major political battle. And that's not new. I mean, that political battle's gone on for as long as we have recorded history about it, sort of the political battle happening. But I think it's the toughest one. And you have to be very careful with the language that you use, and you have to, it demands a tremendous amount of patience, and I'm very good at that patience. I find it really hard, and so we've got some really good senior people doing it for us. You may remember, Mark, Kathy Bushkin, Kathy Calvert. Kathy she is my number 2. Kathy had a long time political history here in Colorado, and it just went from doing politics to being the head of U.S. News and World Report's political side of things, and then became the right hand to Steve Case at AOL. I mean, really very, very skilled and extraordinarily pleasant listener. And so I sort of say, Kathy, it's over to you. And she does. I mean, it makes a big difference. It really makes a big difference. But so we've got some really good people, and we're trying to beef up our capacity, because this is going to go on in the next 3 years, going to the MDGs and so on. The next 3 years is going to be a very, very important one as the world thinks about this issue of engaging women and women's reproductive health and so on. It's a great question. I mean, it's a really interesting question. Please.
Let's do one more question real quick.
Okay. What's our timing?
About 3 or 4
What
minutes.
time do we start?
What time did we start?
Did we start? Whatever we do. We start.
Okay, I'm Billy Day. On behalf of the U.S. League of Women Voters, I attended the Bonn NGO conference in August.
Good for you.
And I'm also a member of UNANCA.
Thank you.
And so my question is, in looking toward Rio, which isn't too far away, what suggestion do you have for UN associations or for the people in this room leading up to that conference? And maybe with the U.S. politicians or public, or do we just kind of stay
Well, I
quiet?
think it's getting, so Rio plus 20 is the middle of June. And, it's coming at us just like a freight train, and people are suddenly discovering that that's going to exist. One of the most heartening things is the commitment of women's groups from all over the country, all over the world, to make sure that they get a major foothold in Rio, so that we don't end up with the second phase of the Millennium Development Goals that doesn't have a major component related to reproductive health and women in it. Right? So that, my guess is that it's, I can't answer that question. I don't know what to do. I couldn't advise you. I think to be writing about it, being aware of it, and trying to, wherever you can, transmit. I don't know what kind of blogs come out of UNA or what kind of things that happen. I think it's extremely important, though, that people know that there is this continuum of thinking about development and cooperation around the world about development, which is the Millennium Development Goals. And that Rio is a step along that way, and a very important one. Let's do a couple more, and then we'll split. Everybody's had enough, please.
My name is Shannon, and I'm an undergraduate here at DU.
Right.
And I was just wondering what you thought about the Kony movement and how, it's something...
In Uganda?
Yeah, well, the social movement that's taking place kind of from Invisible Children, and how it's taken off as this, symbol, and, I've just heard, I have very mixed views on how effective that is as a social movement. I
anytime you have something like that and you can use it as an opportunity to organize people, I mean, I'm appalled. You know, I did that all my life. And by that, I mean, how do you organize people around issues? You know, it's one thing to tell people, but it's another more important thing to try to engage people in what they think, what they can do, how they can impact something. And that's the best kind of organization because that takes a root. So if they're going to, if that's possible, and it looks to me like they are, you know, and Clooney's involved, and a lot of people are involved, and it's getting up a real head of steam, it's terrific. You know, I think anything like that is a very useful thing. And, you know, Rahm Emanuel said, don't let a crisis go unused or something like that. But I mean, I agree with that. You know, when there's an opportunity to use that, you know, use it as a way of thinking about, you know, how do we organize more people who are sympathetic and, you know, believe in the kinds of things that all of us believe in, and use that as an organizational opportunity. Let's do one over here. If there is one over here, and we'll stop. Please, Rod.
I'm Eleanor Dwight from Fort Collins. I wonder what you think of the status now of the UNESCO situation. I don't know where we are exactly on that. I'm very concerned about it. I think we ought to be funding UNESCO, but I'd like to see what you have to say.
Hey, this is an interesting interesting political issue. In the 1990s, AIPAC, the American Israel Political Action Committee, went to the Congress and got the Congress to pass a provision in the last foreign aid authorization bill that said that any UN agency that the Palestinians joined, the U.S. had to automatically withdraw support from that UN agency. And nobody knew that that provision was in the law.